Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Café with your host, Chris Smith.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Science Café here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Welcome to the Daily Planet Cafe. I'm your host. My name is Chris. How many of you are glad to be here? That was almost all of you. That's okay. We'll work on the rest of you. There's only a couple of you. Yeah, I'm glad you all came out to the cafe tonight. Thanks for coming out because it's a gorgeous evening out, but we've got a great place to hang out on a Thursday right here in the Daily Planet Cafe. And of course, if you didn't know, we're here every Thursday night at 7 o'clock in the Daily Planet Cafe, bringing you topics across all disciplines of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and figuring out how those things apply to our daily life every single day of the year. So make sure you check out naturalsciences.org. Come back, check out the schedule, see what's going on. We want you to be a part of the Science Cafe every single week and learn something new. If this is your only first or second Science Cafe, thanks for coming out. The way that the show works is that we've got some extra special guests every week. They come up, they share just a few minutes with us about the things that they are most passionate about, the things that they're most curious about. So we get to learn a little bit from them, and then we flip the tables, and they get to learn a little bit from all of us. We do a nice, good, long Q&A session after each talk, where anything that's on your mind about the night's topic, you've got experts on stage who might know the answers, and it's a great opportunity to help them learn what we're thinking about the things that they think about all the time. So as we go throughout tonight's talk, put a pin in all those questions you have, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can, and hopefully we'll have a really good discussion. Tonight's topic is food. Who likes food? I like food. Yeah. If you don't, you're in trouble. And especially tonight, we're going to be talking about local food, where local food comes from, what it means to be local. And we've got a couple of experts. They didn't want me to say that, but I'm going to say it anyway. We have actually a couple of experts who are going to be joining us on stage for this interesting discussion. And I think they're going to take notes about what you ask. So make sure, do me good, y'all. Ask good questions and make good comments tonight. Our guest speakers tonight, first up, we're going to have Joanne Massey-Lalekas from the North Carolina Botanical Garden in Chapel Hill, where she's the Director of Education. And then we'll have Dara Bloom, who's an assistant professor at North Carolina State University, and the extensions, we got a Wolfpack fan, and the local foods extension specialist at NC State. So, ready to learn something new? All right, let's learn about local food from tonight's special guest. Please put your hands together and welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here tonight. And it's strawberry season. How many of you all have had some nice local strawberries this season? Wonderful. I look forward to that season. They're so delicious. So I'm Joanna, and this is Dara, as he mentioned, just so you can keep us straight up here. And Dara and I worked together for about 5.5 years, up until last fall when I moved from NC State over to Carolina. But we had some fun working together. And we focus on extension education and outreach, and that was my role. Dara also brings the research side into the picture. And tonight's presentation is based off of some curriculum that we worked on together and developed together. So excited to be here with you all tonight. And we've got an urban agriculture theme going on, and they brought us in to bring kind of a big picture view, kind of a framing for the local food movement generally in preparation for some of the urban agriculture talks later on this month, I guess. This summer, sorry. So I will start out our presentation with some broad brush framing and terminology, and then I'll hand it off to Dara to talk more about some of the history, opportunities, and challenges, and what the growing body of research is saying about the impacts of local food. So with that, let me start with describing what we mean by the terminology of food system. So like any system, food systems are complex and interconnected, include lots of related parts, and food system encompasses all of the processes that it takes to feed us. So like a spider web, if you work within one part of that food system, you can impact the other parts of the food system, either positively or negatively. So that's kind of a framework analogy that we'll be using tonight. So what are all of those processes that keep us fed? We refer to these as food system sectors, and we'll start with food production. So that sounds pretty basic, includes all of all different kinds of farms that grow produce, farms that grow livestock or fish, commercial fishing operations, and all kinds of gardens. You may have an urban farm or community gardens, and even your backyards if you're growing food in your backyards. And can include diversified farms that grow both produce and livestock, for example. But we have to dig a little deeper. It also includes a lot of the inputs that are required so that we can grow that food. So land, maybe organic matter, seeds, the different breeds of livestock, the labor that it takes to grow that food. And I'll add too, ecosystem services like native pollinators or native beneficial insects that can be fostered by the native plants in our landscapes as well as out in nature. So the food has to make its way from the farm to our table. Distribution and aggregation is the next sector I'll describe. Aggregation is basically bringing food products from multiple farms together to make their way to the market. And distribution includes transportation and delivery, and also keeping things refrigerated on their way from the farm to the market. The food processing sector, well, sometimes those strawberries change form on the way to the market, right? They may be made into jam, or meat may be made into sausage. And you might hear that sector called value-added processing as well, because it is adding an economic value to that product on its way to the market. The marketing sector, this is a real opportunity for the producer, the farmer, and the consumer to communicate. And it can be very direct. So in a farmer's market where they're actually talking to one another face to face, or it can be indirect through branding or labels, packaging, advertising. And then purchasing. In this sector contains the places where we go shopping for our food, or where we buy food. Supermarket, corner store, restaurants, farmers markets, and it can include institutions that purchase food too. So like this one has the Got to BNC logo right here at the cafe. And schools, hospitals. And in this sector, and Dara will mention this a bit, is where we start talking about issues of food access, or how easy or hard it is to access the food that's healthy and culturally appropriate. Preparation and consumption. This sector includes the decisions and the skills and the knowledge how to cook or otherwise prepare food. And then organic food waste, we can compost or can be processed by worms and makes its way back to a farm or into your backyard garden. But there's a lot of food that's still edible, safe, and nutritious that is making its way into our landfills. And so there's great opportunity there to divert that from the landfill and get it to people who need it. And so I'll add the arrows here. You might hear of this called the food supply chain. And the food supply chain can be long and incorporate all or more of those sectors. There can be more. This is a very simplified model of a very complex system. Or they can be shorter. So for example, a direct market, like a farmer's market, where the farmer interacts directly with the consumer. So all in all, we have these internal components of the food system. And they are interrelated and complex. But we have these external influences as well: political, social, economic, contextual, and environmental. So example of political can be things like commodity payments to farmers, or the policies that dictate what foods a school system can purchase. Economic influences may be the cost of land. You may have heard a lot of new folks are getting into farming, and it's really hard for beginning farmers to purchase land because of high land costs. Social can come into play when we prepare food in the preparation sector. Decisions around what to cook, focusing on health and nutrition perhaps, or taste and convenience, or family traditions, cultural traditions. And then contextual and environmental. And this can include the history of a place. It can also include things like topography. So, for example, in North Carolina, the topography of the state has led there to be many more small farms in the mountains because of the steep slopes, and more larger farms in the eastern part of the state because of the flatter land. And this can also include things like soil types, et cetera, or on the purchasing side of things, how easy it is to get to the places where you can purchase food. So all in all, the take home, again, with that spider web type of an analogy, is internally and externally, all of these are connected. And when you work to change food systems or work within food systems, it's important to know that you can influence these other sectors, no matter what sector you're working within. So that's food system generally. Now, what is a local food system? And this is the Ask the Audience section. So when you all hear the terminology of local food, what does that mean to you? And I suspect you all had some idea in your head when you came to the presentation tonight. So if you want to raise your hand, if you can keep it to just a few words, what do you think of? What does local food mean to you? I will call on you and I'll repeat what you're going to say, and Dara's going to write it on the board. There's no wrong answer. Yes? Grown and processed within 400 miles of her home. Anybody else? No? Oh, come on. Yes? One of the steps in the food system is eliminated. Yes? I know who the farmer, the fisherman, or the butcher is. Right? Who else has an idea? Yes? I got it at a farmer's market. Other thoughts? Homegrown. Who else? Again, there's no wrong answer. We're just trying to hear what you think of it. Yes? CSA food. Okay, great. All right, I think we've got some good, any last? Okay. We'll give you another opportunity perhaps too. So these are very diverse. You have some mileage, you have some who you're buying it from, and we'll go through that a little bit more in a future slide. But for now, let's back up a moment and look at some of the definitions from governmental entities. I'm going to share 2 definitions from the federal government, and there's many more than that, and 1 definition from state government. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in their 2015 report to Congress, define local and regional food systems very similar to how I just described food system generally, but with the caveat that it's place-specific clusters of those sectors. Well, that makes sense, local, regional, place-based, right? So another federal definition through the 2008 Farm Bill, and this was one of the first definitions that really focused on mileage as a definer. And the federal government here defined it based on grown and transported less than 400 miles. So we have somebody in the room who agrees with that one. And if you look in North Carolina, it's 360 miles between New Bern and Asheville. So that feels like a long way. But remember that the federal government, their audience is across the nation. And so if you put that line in Iowa or somewhere else in the Midwest, it doesn't feel so tightly bounded within the state. They also add the caveat within the same state. And so the North Carolina Department of Agriculture defines local food within the boundaries of our state. All that makes sense, right? But how does that relate to some of the other definitions that we heard from you all? So these are just some popular definitions of local food that we hear from consumers. Buying direct from a farmer. We heard that up here. In several ways. CSA food from a farmer's market. You know your farmer or your butcher. The mileage and distance. Some consumers prioritize how far the food is coming or how close the food is grown to their home or where they live. And in this case, it's somewhat similar to the federal definition. Typically, it's a little bit less for consumers, but not always. You may have heard of the 100-mile diet. There's a book about the 100-mile diet. Now, how or by whom it is grown, if a consumer prioritizes that, they may choose to purchase from small-scale farmers or from a farmer that has decided not to use pesticides on their farm, for example. So there's a growing body of research out there that looks at how consumers and communities are defining local food and what their expectations are for local food. And this is a pretty impressive list of what folks are looking for. Be fresher, safer, and healthier. Support small farmers and rural economies. Addressing health disparities and food insecurity. And promoting sustainability, animal welfare, and fair wages. And be better for the environment. That's a lot of real positive expectations around local food. And now I'm going to hand it off to Dara, and she's going to dive into some of the history of why folks have these expectations and what some of the research is saying about those impacts.
Okay, can you all hear me okay? Great. So as Joanna said, we have all these expectations, right? All these things that we're bringing to the table. We heard, social expectations and improving food access, environmental expectations, supporting sustainability, economic, supporting farmers and rural development. So what do we know about the research? What does the research tell us about the ability of local food to actually address all of those expectations? So before we kind of dive into the research, there are a few things to understand about how that research is done and some of the constraints. So the first one is, as we just heard, right, there's no one single definition of local food. So as somebody who does research on local food, that can just drive you crazy, right? How do I measure the impact of something when probably each of you in here has a slightly different definition? And a lot of the different studies that are done might use slightly different definitions too. So if we're trying to look at all the different studies on local food and make some generalizations, it can be hard because they might use slightly different definitions. One might look at a county, one might say 400 miles, one might use just direct consumer sales like a farmer's market. So that's a big challenge. The second is that we don't have a lot of data on intermediated supply chains. So what I mean by that is we talked about direct markets, which would be like a farmer's market or a farm stand where you're buying directly from the farmer. An intermediated supply chain is where the farmer sells to another business, then sells it directly to the consumer. So maybe the farmer is selling to a supermarket, the supermarket's labeling it as local food, it's all within the same boundary, and then the consumer buys it. Or the same thing with a restaurant. So we've seen a lot of growth in those sales, but we don't have a lot of data on that. So until last year, until the 2017 USDA Census of Agriculture, the USDA does a census, just like we're about to do a census of the whole population. Until 2017, this information on intermediate supply chains wasn't asked. So we didn't know a lot about local food other than what was being sold in direct markets, which is why a lot of the studies that I mentioned would use direct markets as their definition of local food, because that was the data that was available. So that really restricts that we know that there's a lot going on with intermediate supply chains, so we're not capturing that a lot of times in the research that we're doing. And finally, these are really complex issues, right? We're talking about food access, food insecurity, rural economic development. Those are really large issues. And so when we start to try to isolate and say, well, what exactly is the impact of the fact that the food is local? What does that do? And if we take the economic impacts as an example, we can't just say, oh, the farmer's market had this much in sales, and therefore that's the economic impact, because some people might be spending money at the farmer's market, that they're not selling at their local supermarket, and that supermarket may also be locally owned and operated. So it's not all just a gain, there's some trade-offs there too. Or if we take the idea of looking at health impacts, think about obesity or issues with health. Like, how do you isolate and say, oh, the fact that the food is local is what's changing someone's health outcome, right? Your health is very complex. It's not just about what you eat. It's about physical activity. It's about your genetics. It's about your community food environment, your social networks. So it's really hard to say what exactly is local food's role in all of that. So we have all of these challenges to really trying to estimate the actual impacts to meet all these expectations that consumers and communities are bringing to the table for local food. So if that's true, then why is local food still so popular, right? We still turn to it as a way to try to address a lot of these issues with a lot of the local food projects that we have. So one reason that I personally think that local food got really popular is because you can kind of think about, there's like a mainstream food system, and then there are kind of these counter movements against that system. So the food system that we have today really intensified and developed after World War II, when we had some synthetic man-made chemical inputs that were developed. We had a lot larger scale farms, a lot fewer people on farms. And the organic movement really emerged as a way to kind of be that counterpoint to that mainstream system. So it was a way to kind of return to the land, think about building soil health, not with synthetic inputs, but with more organic inputs. And so it grew as a movement to the point where it caught the interest of larger corporations and the USDA. So in 2002, the USDA came up with a standard and a certification system for organic food. And a lot of people who were part of that early movement felt like it didn't capture some of the more holistic parts of being organic and some of that more community-based kind of back to the land feeling of that. And at the same time, we had these global organizations. I don't know if you can see this diagram. It's from Phil Howard at Michigan State University. And it basically shows a lot of the more popular organic and sort of natural food brands. And then it shows which large corporation owns them. So I think that there was this growth in sort of corporate ownership in the food system in general, and globalization of that food system at the same time. I think we've seen a real reaction in general against globalization. And so if you can think about kind of like here's the mainstream food system, and you get kind of organics kind of coming along as that counterpoint, but then they start to really kind of, there's this feeling like it's being absorbed into the mainstream food system. And so local food is trying this way to try to bring it back and say, well, it's not just that it's organic, it's just that we also want local control. We want communities to have input and control over the food system. We're kind of reacting against these corporations and globalization and standardization of our food. So I've used this term movement, right? That there's an organic movement and that maybe there's a local food movement. But I think it's important to stop and think about what that means. Again, when we start to think about all these large kind of lofty goals that we're trying to achieve through local food. So have you guys heard this kind of an idea before? Like every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the world you want? Just raise your hand. Have you heard that kind of, right? Like, or vote for your dollars. Or keep calm and vote for your dollars, because you can find a keep calm and do whatever for anything these days. So what's the issue with this? Yeah. Say it again. Okay, so calm is knowledge about the source of how things produce. Anyone else? So here's my question. Yeah. So the comment is that with these large corporations that just spending a few dollars isn't going to impact them. So we can debate both of those points. I think that what concerns me the most about this approach is this question, which is so if I have more dollars, do I get more votes? Like, is that the way this is going to work? Because that feels very inherently undemocratic to me, and it feels like we're excluding a lot of people from having any kind of say in the decision-making process of what we want our food system to look like. So if we're trying to use the market and use our purchasing power to change the way the food system works, we're limiting our impact because we're not including everybody. And I would actually say, I think that consumers, I don't want to dissuade anyone in here, like, if you have the economic means to, try to make change through your purchases, I do think that we are making something of a difference. I think every corporation out there now has a sustainability program, right? And that wasn't true, 10, 15 years ago. And I think that they're hearing us. I do think that there are corporations that are reacting to that. I'm more concerned of just saying, well, what about the people who aren't getting a say in what their food system looks like? And that's kind of the difference between having using this market-based way of making change and thinking about it as a social movement. And that, I think, really is important to keep in mind when we go back to that list that Joanna had. One of the things we talked about was improving food access, addressing health disparities, addressing food insecurity. Like, these are things that people are expecting from the local food projects in their communities. But I think this is one thing to keep in mind when we start to think about that. And in part, one of the reasons and one of the messages that I kind of want to share in terms of thinking about the potential for local food to address food access issues is just to remember that food access is an issue that goes beyond the food system. So the root cause behind food access is poverty. And poverty and people who are living in poverty struggle not only with access to food, but they also need affordable housing. They need affordable health care. We know from research on food insecurity that people are often choosing between paying for their medications and paying for food. Public transportation, we also know from research that this is one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest barriers to healthy food access is public transportation. And I think it's also one of the areas where we have the most potential to address a lot of these other issues here, because if you have good public transportation, you can get to your job on time, you can get to school on time, you can get to your doctor's office. So it's really it's a cross-sector issue. And then finally, a living wage. Really, again, a huge issue of whether or not you have healthy food access is, can you afford that food, which really goes back to that issue of thinking about the market base versus a social movement. On the flip side of that, when we're again thinking about local food projects and how do we design them to address food access, but at the same time support farmers, I think it's really important to remember that many farmers, especially kind of smaller scale, mid-sized farmers, are really struggling to get by themselves. They're not charging higher prices at farmers markets because they're out there getting rich off of our dollars. They're really kind of right at the margins. If they're charging higher prices, it's because they have higher labor costs, because they're doing things more organically, or they're just because they're smaller scale. They don't have the same economies of scale, so they can't buy things in bulk the way larger farms can, and they don't have those kinds of benefits. So they're often charging slightly higher prices just to get by themselves. So when we try to bring these two things together in the same kind of a project, I think that we need to remember that we need some kind of subsidy, like bridging that gap between small-scale farmers and lower-income consumers. You need some kind of financial subsidy to overcome that difference, because the food system isn't designed for those two sectors really to talk to each other. So the really popular ways that we see that happen in local food projects are through federal food assistance programs, so SNAP, which is food stamps, WIC, the Women, Infant, and Children program, the Farmers Market Nutrition program. So we can use those in local food projects. They're all ways to increase purchasing power, to try to give some of those dollars to people who don't have the money necessarily to be able to participate in these these local food projects. You'll see that kind of grant funding as that bridge between producers and consumers. We've also seen a lot of grant funding go to things like food hubs, mobile produce markets, so ways where we can actually kind of get food from farmers to low-income consumers. And because of the grant funding, a lot of those organizations can be socially motivated and then can charge slightly lower prices to consumers and still pay their producers a fair wage. So kind of shifting gears a little bit. So again, thinking about that list that we had of the expectations we have for local food, we get talked a little bit about issues of food access, supporting farmers, but we want to turn a little bit to talk about what are those environmental impacts and what does the research tell us about the environmental impacts of local food. So one is this question of just what is the role of local food to address climate change? So who here has heard of the term food miles? Does that sound familiar? So a lot of times we'll use this term food miles. People will say, well, local food is better for the environment because usually food travels about 1,400 miles, but local food is traveling fewer miles. And the idea behind that is that it has fewer carbon emissions, so it's going to be better in terms of climate change. And the research doesn't really support the use of that word, food miles. So if you walk out of here today, don't use the word food miles. It's just not the best way to talk about the environmental impacts of local food. And part of that is just because overall in the agricultural sector, transportation is only about 11% of greenhouse gas emissions in general. A lot more greenhouse gas emissions happen in production, processing, packaging, home use. And then the other reason is that efficiency is more important than distance. So the picture on this slide is of a railroad car, right? So if food's coming on a train across the country, that's going to have actually much lower greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of our food, from Europe is getting shipped in. So if it comes by ship, it's also going to have really low greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, if we're looking even within the US and looking at tractor trailer trucks, a really well-designed, well-packed tractor trailer truck that's coming across the country or coming from a few hundred miles away might actually be more efficient than a farmer who's got an old beat-up pickup truck and has to drive a few hundred miles to the nearest city because that's where the consumer base is that can afford their food. They're not bringing anything back with them. And then me as a consumer, I'm going out of my way to go to the farmer's market in addition to maybe I like to go to my local dairy and I'm going to my supermarket. So when we start to talk about the greenhouse gas emissions, it's just not the best way to talk about local food. So no food miles. The other thing we wanted to highlight is that because there's so many different definitions of local food, and there isn't a standard, like there's a standard for organic food that the USDA says these are the acceptable agricultural practices that make you organic, we don't have that for local food. So just because something's local, it doesn't mean anything about how food was grown or raised or caught. It doesn't mean necessarily that sustainable practices were used. This is a graph from the same guidebook that Joanna mentioned earlier. It's a report to Congress from 2015 about trends in local food. So you can see the big green circle is farms with local sales, which is both direct and with those intermediated supply chains. And then the yellow circle is farm with organic sales. So you can see there's a little bit of overlap, but there isn't huge overlap. And that doesn't mean that all of these local farms aren't using organic practices. It's very possible that a lot of them are, but if they're in a direct market, they might not get certified because they can talk to people, so they don't need that certification. But it's just a reminder to say that just because food is local doesn't guarantee that any type of certain practices were used on that farm. So if you have a question about it, you can go to your local farmer's market and you can ask your farmer directly. If we kind of return to that question about climate change, I think one of the places where local food really does have a really large role to play is this idea of trying to build resiliency into our system and trying to really diversify production geographically. So these are two maps from the USDA. You can see where it's like the heaviest green and the heaviest red. That's where there's a concentration of fruit and vegetable production. So it's all, where is it all? California. What's going on in California? I mean, we've got fires, we've got drought. I mean, it goes up into Oregon and Washington. They've all had just these terrible wildfires. If you look at fruit production, in addition to that West Coast, we've got Florida, which we've all experienced hurricanes in the Southeast. So as we start to think about these really intensified events that are caused by climate change and where they're hitting, and just the fact that we have a really concentrated production system in this country is an issue. And so if we want to start to think about the role that local and regionalized food can play in that, it can really help to just try to diversify production across the whole country so that we aren't all kind of at risk. And I would say too, it goes both ways. I think that if you think about, if we get hit by a hurricane, I want my national food supply there because my local farmers might not be able to meet that demand anymore. But if something happens in California, I want to know my local farmers are here too and can supply us. So we've shared a lot of what the research is about, again, the environment, food access, some of these social issues. But I want to ask you guys, so is buying local food good for the economy? Yes. Why do you say yes? Yeah, your money is staying locally. What's that? Depends which economy? What do you mean? So if your food is leaving your area, you've got an influx of funds. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah, so the idea of cutting out the middleman is often something we hear, right? So the idea that if in a direct market you don't have the middleman, so the farmer keeps more of that money, which is true. Although there have been some studies that look at the trade-off between direct marketing and selling to a middleman, because it can actually, there's so much more labor that goes into the direct market, so farmers can still benefit in wholesale markets, but. That's another point. So yeah, so the idea, a lot of the research does support the idea that local food is good for your local economy. We talk about the multiplier effect, and it's exactly what you said, this idea that when you spend money locally, it tends to get respent within your local economy. So every dollar that you spend generates another, say, 30 cents worth of economic activity. So we have some studies that show that farmers also will tend to hire people locally and purchase more of their inputs locally too. Did you have a comment?
Equipment that's being purchased elsewhere and inputs that are coming from elsewhere. Does local food actually increase getting that locally as well?
And there are a few studies that have come out of California in the past couple of years. Hopefully they're still applicable to the rest of the country, but they do suggest that local farmers are purchasing their inputs locally. I don't know specifically about machinery, but maybe more like seeds and things like that. But the idea that, if they've got local labor, then, that money is also staying within the local economy, because those people will shop locally and contribute locally and pay taxes and all those things too. Yeah. The other way that we see economic impacts is that we have studies that show that people who go to farmers markets will then also tend to purchase at the businesses that are near those farmers markets. So we see a little bit of a spillover effect that way. And then finally, local food markets can really help to support entrepreneurship. So if I want to start a bakery, say, it can be really expensive for me to rent a whole building and pay staff and kind of keep that going. But I can pretty easily get a spot at my local farmers market and start to build a consumer base and relationships and kind of experiment with what kind of products people want. So it can really help with that local business development. Okay, how about this one? Is local food healthier than non-local food? Depends on how long it was on the road. Anyone else? I would say it depends how long it was on the road, and it depends how well it was refrigerated. Because it can be not on the road for very long, but if it isn't refrigerated, I think it loses nutritional value pretty quickly. So it's part of the cold chain as well. We will say, just in general, local food isn't necessarily healthier than local food, right? So if we go back to this idea that we don't have one standard definition of local food, we can't really generalize and say that in general it's healthier or not healthier. There is some research that shows that direct markets are associated with weight loss, lower rates of diabetes, lower body mass indexes, but you'll see on this slide there's an asterisk there because it's that word association. A lot of times that research is kind of looking at a county and saying like, oh, there are healthier people where there are more farmers markets, which doesn't necessarily mean that more farmers markets are causing those people to be healthier. It might also be that we have more farmers markets where there are more people who are interested in buying fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's an association, not necessarily that it's causing it. There is also research, mostly that's done around specific projects like a CSA, community-supported agriculture, or community garden. And that research suggests that people who are purchasing local food or growing it themselves do eat a greater variety of vegetables, they consume more vegetables, and they report that their children are eating more fruits and vegetables. There's also, we don't have it on the slide, but there's a lot of data coming out on farm-to-school programs where children are eating more fruits and vegetables when they have local food in the cafeteria, especially when it's accompanied with all the educational activities that come with farm-to-school. So this is a publication that we published, Joanna and I published with some colleagues out of NC State Extension that basically summarizes all of the research that I just talked about. And we can have some copies for you here today. I think one of the big messages that we try to get through in that publication and that we want you to take home today is, we're not standing up here trying to debunk local food and say, oh, the research doesn't support, local food. I think what we're trying to say is that there are all these different ways of defining local food, but I think that we have a really exciting moment because people are really interested in where their food comes from. We've got consumers coming. You guys all came out tonight to talk about it. We've got communities that are forming local food councils to talk about it. And so we have this moment to really try to understand what exactly are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to have conversations about hunger and food insecurity in our communities? Are we worried about our rural areas and are they going to survive economically? Are we going to have small and mid-sized farmers left? It's a way to start to have these conversations. And if we can try to start to understand what those values are that people are bringing to the table, what community members are expecting from local food systems. None of the outcomes that we just talked about are guaranteed from local food systems, but if we know what our expectations are, we can build local food systems that address those outcomes. So we can create a local food system that does include healthy food access and supporting farmers, environmental benefits. So we encourage you all to think about that and how you can work towards that in your own community. So we have this extension publication. I also run or manage this one site about food access, which is on the local food portal for NC State. And just wanted to mention that portions of this presentation came from the Extension Master Food Volunteer Program out of NC State Cooperative Extension, and then turn it over to all of you for questions and discussion.
Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. All right, it's your turn. If you've got questions for our guests, wave at me or wave at Katie. We'll pass the microphones around and make sure that we can get to as many questions as we can. But if we haven't got to you, just stare us down and wave, and we'll make sure that we get a microphone to you. Let's get started.
So the last stage in the food system slide way back at the beginning of your presentation was waste. And I think many of us know that there is a lot of waste in the food system. I'm wondering if you have a sense of whether, as food systems become more local, there is in some way less waste. Is there an efficiency to the local food system that in some way mitigates against waste?
Yeah, so I'll start just a little bit. I will share. That's a great question. I'm not sure if anyone, at least that I know of, has looked specifically at that question. I know Joanna's asked that same question sometimes, and I'll let her talk about that piece of it. I will say I've been involved in a research project that's looked at on-farm food waste as an issue, and because a lot of food that's grown doesn't get harvested, even because if it doesn't meet certain specifications for supermarkets. So if you go to the supermarket, everything looks exactly the same and it looks perfect, and so a lot of food will get left in the field or doesn't make it out of to the market because of that. And I think in local local markets, like if you go to the farmers market, like people are proud about their like crooked carrots and their funny looking food. So I would guess from the on-farm piece of it that there might be less waste because it's making it because there isn't as much kind of selection for kind of the prettiest kind of uniform food. But that's just a guess. I'm not sure. It's a great question.
Well, I'll just add to that and get back to some of the broadest impacts are in from the community development side of local food. And by raising awareness about the local food system and the food system generally, there's more people talking about that food waste. And so there's more organizations coming in to try and capture that before it becomes waste, the food that's still safe and edible and nutritious. And food banks and food pantries are playing a role in that as well. You may have heard of organizations that focus on gleaning. So it's a big deal with sweet potatoes in the state. Organizations that get volunteers go out in the field after the farmer has harvested and pick up the leftover sweet potatoes and take them to the food banks. So great opportunity there.
Hi. USDA farm subsidies seem to go to the Midwest, to the big corporate farms for corn and things like that, rather than for vegetables, fruits, and so forth. And they're making corn cheap, but it's keeping the healthier stuff more expensive. And that impacts, low-income people. Is there any movement away from this kind of mess?
That's a really great question. I'll say I'm not a policy expert, so I've definitely heard that argument before. I think that subsidies were actually kind of taken out of the last farm bill and replaced by crop insurance, although I think that the distribution of the farmers that they were supporting was still there. Definitely heard from smaller scale fruit and vegetable growers that they wish that they had more crop insurance, and that this idea about can we subsidize, if we're trying to push healthy food and we know that people aren't consuming enough fresh fruits and vegetables, can we find a way to subsidize that? And I don't know if like a movement to actually do that, if it's realistic at all to incorporate in the farm bill. It's a great question. I have a colleague, Dr. Lindsay Haynes Maslow, who is our resident farm bill expert at NC State. She's in my Department of Agricultural and Human Sciences. Maybe she could be another speaker to talk about the farm bill and food policy. Yeah, thanks.
I've got one.
Yeah.
A little bit earlier in the show, you were talking about SNAP, EBT, WIC programs. Do you see wide adoption within these direct markets of those programs where somebody could walk into a farmer's market with those vouchers or forms of assistance and actually be able to purchase things? Because I think of farmers markets as often just sort of cash-based economy, and I don't know much about the ability for people to use things like that in those situations.
Yeah. I'll start us off on that one because it is actually something that I think about a lot because there's actually a very strong movement to try to get farmers markets to be able to accept SNAP EBT, and there are also a lot of programs that then try to double up people's bucks. Has everyone heard of like double up bucks programs? So where you actually can use grant funding, or I live in Durham, so I think the Durham Farmers Market, they use like the surcharge that you pay at the ATM, so you don't feel as guilty using the ATM, actually will go to fund their double up bucks program so that you get matching dollars. So for every $20 of your SNAP benefits that you use in the market, you get another $20 to use in the market. Excuse me. And I will say that depending on the market, it depends kind of how successful that is. Again, I live in Durham. It seems like it's been really successful there. But some of the stories that so I work with cooperative extension, and that means I work with folks who are out in our county offices that are connected to the university. So a lot of the stories that I hear back from our agents out in those offices in the counties is, okay, our farmers market can now accept SNAP EBT, but we still have really low redemption rates. Like, people still aren't coming to the market. Like, why isn't this working? And I think that there are a few different reasons for that. One, I think, we're trying to solve this issue of food access, but we're not, right? We're trying to do that from within the food system. And like I said, there are all these other issues with, poverty and all these other, transportation. So a farmer's market might be on a day where someone's working, it might not be near a bus line. Honestly, some farmers markets just aren't very comfortable spaces. A lot of farmers markets, especially in like the suburbs, are like pretty, they could be pretty white. They might not be very comfortable for people of color to go to. And it's not, we like to think about food access when we work with a lot of communities on food access of, how can we meet people where they are? Like, why are we trying to make people come to a whole new location? Like, there's any way that we can, make it easier for people to access local food, in a grocery store, through their faith community, at a corner store. So we've tried to, our approach within extension is to try to say, like, okay, if a farmer's market comes to one of our extension agents and says, we want to offer SNAP EBT, that our first comment back is like, okay, we can work with you on that, but let's also think about what it means to do a deeper level of community engagement here and say, who are you trying to bring to the market? Is the community that you're trying to bring to the market, are they represented on your board or any kind of decision-making process? Do you have farmers who look like or speak the language of the people who you're trying to bring to the market? Do you know anything about the interests and the people of your community of where they want to buy healthy food? So really to start to think about how do you do a deeper level of engagement with your community, rather than just assuming that if you have SNAP EBT at the market, people are going to flock to the market. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm a little passionate about it. Okay.
I enjoy shopping at the farmers market, the local farmers market. And I've been disappointed when, for example, I went to my favorite peach producer to get my favorite brand of peach and was told that well, they sold their entire crop of that peach to a grocery chain. I also spend a lot of time at the coast, and I've been told by a fish store owner that the very best grades of especially shellfish, shrimp, crabs, and oysters go to the restaurant chains. And so it seems to me that at these local places, us locals are getting the rest. We're not getting the best. Is that generally true?
I think that gets back to the point that Darryl was making. Is it's making broad generalizations like that may not be the best way to talk about the food system. I could see that you have some specific points, but I doubt that would be a generalization, and from my experience, not a generalization across the food system and in every market. I think what you're talking about is some farmers that are looking at ways that help them to remain profitable, and the farmers there must have identified that selling in those ways helps them stay profitable. In fact, that's part of some of the research is revealing that that beginning farmers that sell at direct markets have higher staying and business power. And those farmers that are blended between selling in direct markets and intermediated markets are seeing more profitability generally. So it's part of that understanding and that communication with the farmer and understanding why they're doing that. It's an opportunity for consumers to learn more about what the farmers are up against in order to stay profitable.
So I live right close to where the new Wegmans is going to open, and a lot of people are happy about that, but it's potentially going to cause massive traffic problems. And it's right on top of a Costco, and we have a Harris Teeter. And I'm just wondering what is driving these large grocery chains that seem to be coming here. I know this area is growing, but why do they choose the locations that they choose?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. That would probably be one for an economist. Dara, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I will probably say purchasing power, right? So a lot of times, like have you guys all heard the term food desert? So the idea of a food desert is that there isn't a supermarket within a 1 mile radius in a neighborhood in an urban area or a 10 mile radius in a rural area. Because I'll say the flip side of that would be a food desert, right? And I don't love the term food desert. So if you walk out here tonight and you don't use food miles and you don't use food deserts, I'll be a happy person, right? Because who actually lives their lives spatially like that? Like, oh, I only go at 1 mile within my, I might commute and shop somewhere else. I might shop where there's the better deals. We know from research that people who are low income are going out of their way to go to Walmart because it's cheaper. And also, if you live within 1 mile of a supermarket and you're in a wheelchair or you don't have a car, you've got little kids behind you, it's a long way to come with, carrying a few bags of groceries behind you. So I don't think that the term food desert takes into account consumer behavior and isn't really the best way to define it. But I will say that part of the food desert idea too is, how you frame a problem is then how you solve it. So, are we actually saying we need a supermarket in every single 1 mile radius? Because, the flip side of that is also, if people in those areas that we're calling food deserts, like if they had the purchasing power of, downtown Raleigh or Cary, there'd be supermarkets flooding in, right? So my guess would just be to say, I think they think that this is an area that is booming and that people have good jobs and that they've got money to spend. And I love Wegmans because I lived for 8 years in Pennsylvania. So, but that would be my best guess.
I had two thoughts. One was a friend of mine made his own product, which was barbecue sauce, and it was extremely difficult to get into a grocery store. And even if you did, you're on the very top shelf or the very bottom shelf because you got to pay money to be on the aisle level. The second thought was that a lot of stuff in grocery stores is genetically there because it travels well, and like tomatoes really don't taste that good. And it seems like local food people could do well by having things heirloom tomatoes, and you go to a grocery store, there's 3 kinds of potatoes, and in Peru there's 12 kinds. So there's a lot of things out there that are good, but they just don't end up in grocery store for transportation reasons or whatever.
I'll take the first part of that just to say I work with some folks in food safety who work with, like thinking about processing and stuff like that. I think barbecue sauce is like one of the top things that people try to start a new business in. So that might also be part of the hard part about getting it into the supermarket. But do you want to say something about?
Yeah, you've pointed out a real opportunity for direct markets because the food doesn't have to travel as far. It doesn't have to have those same properties. And so it can be, farmers can select varieties for taste and other reasons that are a great opportunity for consumers to get at those direct markets.
And I'll add too that, when we talked about health, I think one of the other things we can think about is, yeah, it doesn't, like strawberries, right? The strawberries we're getting right now compared to the strawberries you get in the middle of the winter, so it's such a huge difference. And if food tastes better, you're more likely to eat more of it. So if you've got vegetables that have more taste or fruits that taste better, hopefully you're consuming more of them.
Well, I'm a shift manager with Hart, and we get our lettuce, and brings our stuff to us. But the thing of it is, our lettuce is often grown on the west coast or somewhere out west. But sometimes we'll get lettuce that the outer leaves will look all right, but the inner leaves will have these brown spots on them, and it's like, and I was wondering, that's a shame because you talk about food waste. A lot of times that's what happens. People don't package it right, and keep it refrigerated properly. These brown spots will form, and then you stuff and throw half the lettuce away. But on the other hand, with locally grown, I would assume that would not be such a big problem because it would get to you quicker than, and the local grown people, I think, would probably be more careful because the product community want to handle that product in a better way, that people would be willing to stay with them. And Bob, what do y'all think on that? What's your opinion?
So I would say, I think our theme here is to try to avoid making too many generalizations about local food because everyone's different. I did actually spend about 8 years in Pennsylvania, and so I would go to a farmer's market where there were a lot of people who were Amish, and that was always my example to say, actually what I might be getting from the farmer's market, like a lot of those farms out in California, they've got these like fancy refrigerators that are out in the field, and so as soon as it's picked, it's in the refrigerator, and they maintain that. We call it the cold chain. It's refrigerated like right in the field all the way through, like it's never not refrigerated when it gets to you. And here I'm in Pennsylvania looking at food at grown by people who are Amish. It hasn't been refrigerated. Maybe it's sitting out for a few hours at the end of a 90-degree day. It's maybe a little bit wilted. It might not be quite as fresh. And, that's not to say, yes, local farmers are absolutely, they're also handling food really well. They know what they're doing. You see a lot of people bringing coolers to the farmers market because of that. So I'm not saying that all local farmers don't know how to handle it, but just that they're, those are kind of like those two extremes of why we can't make generalizations about local food and, is it fresher or healthier because of that.
And again, that's the opportunity at the direct markets is to talk to your farmer about these things.
So I had a question about identity of farmers markets, and it was inspired by your reaction to Wegmans, and I hear people's reaction to Trader Joe's and this allegiance to grocery stores that is so passionate and personal, but I never hear that about farmers markets. Maybe because people think of them as a concept that's almost generic, and yet they should be just the opposite because they're so individual. So what's there to be done?
I'm also really passionate about my farmer's market. I've got my Durham farmer's market cap. I use it as examples. It's a great question. I don't know. I guess I feel like people are kind of passionate. It depends as Joanna said, it depends on the place. I feel like living in the Triangle, the people that I know, the Carborough farmer's market is like a religion on Saturday morning, right? And same thing with Durham. We have like 3 farmers markets in Durham. So I feel like maybe it's just the circles that I run in. I feel like there is that passion, but that question of how do we bring that to others? I'm not sure.
I think that's an opportunity to bring up a point too with farmers markets is there are growing numbers of them, and having more farmers market in a community is not always the best solution because it provides more opportunities for consumers, but it divides the farmers across more market opportunities. So they may make less at the market that they were selling at previously or have to pay more labor to go to multiple markets in order to maintain that profitability.
I think you may have answered it a little bit. but I actually have been working at one of these farmers markets for several years now. And when I first started, you couldn't walk down the aisle because there were so many people, and sales were skyrocketing. But over the past few years, we've definitely seen a decline in attendance, and sales have been, cut into 2/3, halved, plummeting. And I have a couple of personal theories, but I'm wondering if you have any experience with this, why that might be. Is it just my farmer's market? Is this a all-around thing? Because the local movement seems to be really popular, so where are the people supporting local?
What market are you at?
I'm actually at the one right by NC State down, off Lake Wheeler. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, some of the research is showing that as there are more farmers markets in communities, that they kind of cannibalize each other, and so that can lead to dwindling numbers at some as they increase in others. And that's that interconnection that I talked about early on, is that you have to be careful what decisions you're making as you change your food system and how it influences other aspects of the system.
Yeah, I definitely agree that that's what we're seeing, is that this cannibalization of the same consumer base, that we get more markets but not necessarily more consumers at the market. I think I've also heard, again, just kind of a hypothesis of, as there are increased, I think as the gentleman mentioned before, there are increased market opportunities for farmers. So, in addition to farmers markets, now we have food hubs. They can maybe sell at the supermarket, they can sell to schools, they can sell to restaurants. And as there are more local food markets, it might also, we see that intermediated supply chains really going up, that those are getting more profitable too, I think. But you're definitely not alone. Yeah, it's a trend, and you can see the growth in farmers markets. I think it was like a 200% increase starting from like the 1970s until about like the 2000 something, and it's really plateaued in the last couple of agricultural census. Yeah.
So first of all, Dara and Joanna, a great job. So I have, my background is technology, so in computer science and data and all that. So I have a comment and I have a question, so I'll go with the comment if I may. So the comment is that we used to go to farmers market a lot. And then it seems to me that it's almost like an encouragement to waste food, and the groceries chains, whether you start from Costco, big ones, or Harris Teeter, Kroger, of course gone now, they encourage you to buy a lot. Whether or not that's fresh or not, I don't know. That's just a comment. My question is, did you guys have an opportunity to do some research in terms of the world population, which, as I checked today, it was 7.7 billion people live in this world. And then we talked about the food security. Did you have any research in terms of how much food do we need, or are we going to run out of food? Whether you look at the farmers market versus grocery and all things food.
So I feel like how many people have heard that argument, right? That's like, oh my gosh, we're going to have like 9.9 billion people in 2050. How are we going to feed them all? So I hear that, and it makes me nervous. Like I don't want to make decisions out of fear, right? I don't want someone trying to scare me into thinking that means that we have to, that like everything else has to go by the wayside, and we just have to focus on yields because we just need to increase yields because that's the only important thing. And I don't think it is the only important thing. I think our food system needs to be designed in a way that is, yes, feeding people, but also feeding people healthy food, also supporting farmers, also supporting a diversity of farmers, a diversity of production. I feel like that's often used to just push one type of agriculture. And I think that the best way forward, but this is my personal opinion, is to have a lot of different types of agriculture at different scales using different techniques. I think that's how you build resiliency into a system. And so I don't love talking about population and how do we increase how much food we produce. Partly also that is, we talked earlier about food waste. I think that is also partly because we know that there is so much waste in the existing system. I don't think that we really have a problem with not producing enough food. I think we have a problem with with getting food to people, especially in developing countries. In developing countries, most of the food waste happens like trying to get food to market because they don't have the same kind of transportation, refrigeration systems that we do. And in this country, right, it's about can people afford that healthy food, right? So I think those are really the issues we need to focus on. I mentioned I was involved in some research that looked at on-farm food waste, and it's really, really high percentages of food that's not making it out of the field, and farmers can't justify going back in for another harvest if prices are too low to pay their labor to do that, and they're not going to make a profit. So I think we need to look at the system we have, how much food is already being produced, and think about all the things we're trying to accomplish, right? All those things of, food access, food insecurity, social, we have social goals, not just feeding people out of the food system.
It's the spider web of interconnections. Yeah.
Let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Appreciate it. I don't know. I'm glad there's two smart people working on it, aren't you? I hope so. Joanna mentioned it, but we are, through the rest of the summer, we're going to be doing a handful of other cafes on this sort of broad topic of urban agriculture and urban food systems. So I hope that you'll come back. Check out naturalsciences.org for upcoming dates. You can check out the event page for today. I believe the next one is June, the third week of June, I believe. But we've got how to grow fruits in your own backyard. We're going to be talking about backyard chickens. There's lots of stuff you want to know about and hear about. It's all going to be right here at the Science Cafe. So I hope you'll come back soon. And I think the Canes game starts in like 5 minutes. So I'll go ahead and let you go. And next Thursday night, we will be in the WRAL 3D Theater screening a special documentary about hidden rivers. Documentary Hidden Rivers, and we'll have a special Q&A following the film. So we're going to be doing something special, not here, over in the other building next Thursday night. Hope to see you all again soon. Good night, everybody.